About 10 years ago, I read a book that was about his life. Louis Zamperini, he was born in California, raised in California. In his early life, he kind of had a troubled youth. He was kind of a ruffian around town, as a basic troublemaker. He was going to get into big trouble, maybe getting kicked out of high school. And so his brother, his older brother, kind of went to bat for him with the principal. And he said, what if Louis starts running? What if he competes on the track team? And the principal says, okay, fine, we'll try to redirect this energy. Turns out Louis was an incredible athlete. He worked really, really hard, and he got really, really fast. In fact, his senior year, he set a world record for the high school mile time, faster than anyone had ever run the mile in high school. Later on in 1936, he competed in the Olympic Games in Berlin, and he did okay there, but he really was setting his sights on to compete later on. This hard work that just dominated his life and permeated his life. Basically this idea that whatever you're doing, do all that you can. Like whatever it is that you're doing, just do everything you can. So as time went on, the U.S. entered into World War II, and Louis volunteered. He became a bombardier, and in the South Pacific, and went on many flights. At one point, his plane was shot down over the South Pacific. He crashed. Virtually everyone died instantly. Just Louis and two other guys lived, and they climbed aboard a life raft. And they just tried to survive, just tried to hang on. They drifted for days and days. In fact, after 33 days, one of the men died, and they let his body fall into the sea. At one point, this Japanese Zero set of planes came and saw their life raft there and just started strafing them for like 30 minutes. And didn't hit either of the guys, but apparently put in over 50 bullet holes in the rubber life raft. It's just incredible. They just patched it up. And they were surrounded by sharks this entire time. They had virtually no food. After 47 days and almost 2,000 miles of drifting, they finally saw land for the first time. They paddled their way to shore. And before they could even step foot on shore, a Japanese boat came around and saw them and caught them and captured them. For the next 2 years, Louis was in a prisoner of war camp. Some of the guards were incredibly cruel. Some were not. There was one in particular who was especially vindictive at Louis because he knew he was the famous track star. And basically, he saw it as his personal mission to try to break the spirit of this man. So for 2 years, Louis was starved, and he was tortured and psychologically abused and physically abused. He lost over 100 pounds. He got down to like 61 or 63 pounds. He was scheduled, and the other men in the camp were scheduled to be killed within hours when the Japanese emperor issued an unconditional surrender, and Louis' life was spared. And all that time, right, on the life raft, all that time in the prisoner of war camp, here's Louis' mentality, here's Louis' spirit, right? Do all that you can, do everything that you can. In difficult situations, just change the situation. In difficult situations, do what you can. And there's something for us too. We recognize that that's what we're called to do. I think sometimes people look at Catholic Christians and think that we might be fatalist, or like, we believe in this fatalism. Like, well, if that's the situation, these are the cards you're dealt, just play them out. Just accept the situation as it comes. Don't do anything. That's fatalism. That's not what we believe as Catholics. We believe that, no, we're called to do all that you can. In fact, another way to say it is, we're called to actively engage in life. The temptation for many of us is to become passive observers of our own life. But as Christians, as followers of Christ, we're called to actively engage our own life. We're called in every situation to do everything that we can. If the situation is difficult, do what you can to change the situation, which is why the first reading on the book of Leviticus, it's, all Leviticus is these rules that the Lord God is giving to the people of Israel. Basically saying, if you see injustice, do something about it. If you see someone who's suffering, do something about it. These rules today, care for those who are around you. And that's really, really good. It's really, really essential. It's helpful for us. But what happens when you've done all that you can and nothing's changed? What happens in our lives when you've done all that you can and you're still powerless? What happens when we've done all that we can and we're still stuck? What happens when we've done all we can and we're still homeless? And for the last 6 weeks, we've been doing this series called Homeless. That the reality, of course, is that we are living in this world as exiles. That this biblical theme of this is not home, but we have to live here. This is not where we belong, but we have to figure out a way to move forward. And one of the pains of exile, right, the pains of being homeless, is we begin to forget who we are. But another pain of being homeless, another pain of being powerless, being stuck, is we begin to lose hope. And we begin to lose trust because, yeah, I'm not home and there's no way for me to get home. Louis Zamperini, when he was rescued, essentially when they declared the unconditional surrender of Japan to the Allied forces, he got back home, and there's a book about him, there's a movie about him, it's called Unbroken. And the book gets a lot of things right, or the movie gets a lot of things right, but the book is just vastly better, exponentially better than the movie is. Because the ironic thing is that here's Louis, who lived through this horrible time. Here's Louis, who did all that he could on the life raft. He did all that he could in the Japanese prisoner of war camp, lost at sea, tortured, only to come home and realize that he actually had been broken. The book is kind of a misnomer. The movie is kind of a misnomer because it did break him. Immediately when he got back, he was celebrated. Immediately he was famous. He was this track star who they thought he was dead for over 2 years, and now he is alive, and he was asked to tell his story all over the place. And so he recounted the story. He was wined and dined, and what he realized is that he hadn't dealt with how the bird, this man who had attacked him, who had tortured him and tormented him, he hadn't dealt with what that did to his heart. He had nightmares. He couldn't sleep through the night, and so he started drinking to try to get himself to forget. He tried to escape reality. He had come home and he had actually met this woman and married her, fell in love with her, incredible. But the more he drank, the more he became angry. The more he drank, he became hateful, and he was on the verge of divorce. He was powerless. He was stuck. He had done all that he could do, and nothing had changed. He was homeless. And so we have to ask ourselves the question, like this is the most difficult season of his life. In the most difficult season of our life, what's our response? That when we've done all that we can do, then what? I think in the gospel today, Jesus tells us then what? So obviously in the gospel, Jesus is speaking to us, but his immediate audience is a whole different group of people, right? Jesus' immediate audience is giving this Sermon on the Mount. He's talking to people who are Jews who are under Roman occupation. These are Jews who are completely powerless in the face of the Roman Empire. And these are Jews who, not only in the face of the Roman Empire, but the preceding Greek Empire and the preceding Persian Empire and the preceding Babylonian Empire, that these are this people that have been oppressed and they've been subjected and subjugated by these world powers for centuries. And they're stuck. And what does Jesus tell these people who are stuck to do? He says, okay, you've heard it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, offer no resistance to one who's evil. If someone strikes you on your right cheek, give them the other as well. If someone asks for your cloak, give them your tunic as well. If someone presses you into service for 1 mile, go with 2 miles. And I don't know about you, but I think that sometimes when I look at this could look to me like giving up. It could look to us like what Jesus is telling them is just give up. In the face of, you've done all you can, now just quit. You've done everything you can, there's nothing more to do, simply give up. Because what Jesus is describing is maybe what you describe as the behavior of a defeated person. What you describe is the way someone who is broken might act. It's like what there's a psychologist named Martin Seligman, what he would describe as learned helplessness. Martin Seligman had done a number of experiments on animals and saw this behavior in human beings, this idea that you can, if you put a person or an animal, a creature, any kind of thing in a situation where there's uncontrollable bad events, and there's this perceived lack of control, there can become a generalized sense of helpless behavior. These are the 3 steps. The first step is you get exposed to uncontrollable bad events, something you have no power over. Secondly, you have this perceived lack of control. I can't do anything about this. And so then what happens when you're exposed to this again and again and again, you begin to embrace this generalized helpless behaviors. He called it learned helplessness. So basically, it doesn't matter what I do. So I might as well give up. I think giving up, even the reality of giving up, it's so fascinating. It's, what are we doing when we give up? I think what we're doing is we're saying, when things are too big, I need to escape. Like in so many ways, that's what giving up is. It's just things are too big for me. I don't know what to do. This is too big for me to control. And so I'm going to avoid things. I'm going to escape. So I'm going to avoid making the call. I'm going to avoid the hard conversation. I'm going to avoid doing the thing I know I need to do, whether that's writing the paper or going to practice or facing my own self or even like facing my own sadness, facing my own grief. Instead of doing that, I'm going to escape. Right? Remember, we have this big temptation. The temptation is to become passive observers of our own life rather than active participant. And we do this in so many ways, in big ways, but we also do this in so many small ways. I mean, whenever we binge, when we scroll, we escape. I mean, think about how ironic is it that in order to escape reality, I binge and watch a reality TV show. Like, how ironic is it that in order to escape my life, I scroll through someone else's life? How ironic is it that to avoid doing the things I need to do, I watch other people doing things? How ironic is it that to avoid living my own life, I escape and watch someone else's life? It's what I end up doing. I end up turning my back on the issue. I end up, whatever I'm facing, I end up turning my back on the obstacle. I end up turning my back on the challenge. I end up turning my back on the grief that has come to me. And when I do that, I end up turning my back on life. That's giving up. I don't want to face the difficulty. I don't want to face what feels like it's too much, what feels like it's uncontrollable. I can't do anything more about this. And so I'm just going to escape. I'm just going to give up. But maybe, of course, maybe you're someone who's like Louis Zamperini, right? Someone who's like, no, are you kidding me? I'm going to do everything I can. So when you see an obstacle, you're like, I'm going to get past this. Maybe you're the kind of person who says, when you see an issue, I'm going to deal with it. When you see a challenge, I'm going to address it. When you face a problem, like, no, listen, I'm going to solve it. That's great. That's wonderful. I love that. But still, what happens when you can't? What happens when there's an obstacle you can't get past? What happens when there's a challenge you can't address? Especially when we're living homeless, when we're living in exile. We can say, listen, I have to figure this out. I have to find a way to get home. I have to find a way to fix this. I have to solve this problem. So there's a problem with that, and the problem is that every one of us, we're going to face grief. Every one of us, we're going to face suffering. Every one of us are going to face struggle and fears, because that's just a part of life, and I can't solve life. Because life is not a problem to be solved. Life is a story to be lived. So we have the book of Daniel that we've been talking about for so long. And right, remember when the people of Israel went into exile, they were homeless in Babylon. What did Jeremiah say? Jeremiah 29, he says, okay, listen, I brought you here, so what you need to do, build homes and live in them. I need you to plant gardens and eat the produce. I need you to get married, have children. I need you to increase, not decrease. And so that's what they did. That's what Daniel did. That's what Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, those four, that's what they all did. But then there was this moment, and the moment involved a statue. In chapter 3 of Daniel, there's this moment that involves a statue. King Nebuchadnezzar, he set up a statue of himself, and he made this declaration. He said, whenever you hear the song, I'm going to play a bagpipe or cymbals, all these kind of horns, everyone is going to bow down, and everyone's going to worship the statue of me. That's what he says in Daniel chapter 3. What now? What do you do now? What do Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael do? Do they just ignore it? Do they avoid it? Do they escape? Do they give up? They don't. In fact, they were living in exile. They were living homeless, but they knew to whom they belonged. And so basically, they refused to bow down and worship this statue. So then in Daniel chapter 3, verse 13, it says, Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and sent for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, aka Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, who were then brought before the king, and King Nebuchadnezzar questioned them, and he says, is it true that you will not serve my God? Is it true that you will not worship the golden statue that I set up? He goes on to say, he says, be ready now to fall down and worship the statue I made whenever you hear the sound of the trumpet or the lute or the lyre or the harp, all these things. Otherwise, here's the consequence, otherwise you shall be instantly cast into the white hot furnace. And who is the God that can deliver you out of my hands? Who's the God who can deliver you out of my hands? So maybe they should just give up. They are powerless. They're stuck. There's nothing they can do. But there's a problem with giving up. Giving up is choosing to avoid the painful parts of life. Giving up is choosing to avoid the parts of life I can't control. Choosing to give up is choosing to avoid the uncertainties of life. If I do that, I end up choosing to avoid life. When I've done all that I can do, the answer is not, we'll just give up. It's funny, the answer is also not try harder. I don't know if anyone's ever given you that advice. You're working really hard, you're trying to do the thing, and they're like, well, have you ever considered just working harder? That's not the answer either. The answer is not giving up. Jesus gives us the answer today. It's in the gospel. What looked like giving up is actually something completely different. Jesus tells us, surrender. Now, I know I say that and you can be like, well, that's the same thing. They're literally synonyms. They mean the exact same thing. Yes, in many cases, they mean the exact same thing, but not when it comes to Jesus. Jesus is highlighting in the gospel today that surrender is actually the opposite of giving up. Because what's giving up? Giving up is an escape. Giving up is I'm going to avoid the harsh reality. Giving up is I'm going to not think about this. I'm going to disengage. To surrender means I'm going to actively engage in this moment. To surrender means saying yes to the present moment. To surrender means I'm going to acknowledge and accept the fact that there's grief. I'm going to acknowledge and accept the fact that my life is marked by suffering. I'm going to accept and acknowledge the fact that what I thought was going to be the case is not the case. What I'd hoped for is not here. To surrender means I'm not going to escape reality or avoid reality or ignore reality. To surrender means in the reality of life, I'm going to say yes to it. I'm going to accept this situation as it actually occurs. See, giving up is marked by losing hope, but surrender is marked by this one word that changes absolutely everything. Giving up is marked by losing hope, but surrender is marked by trust. I said that's the difference. The chief difference between giving up and surrender is trust. Because I'm tempted to escape. But God's calling you and calling me to engage. I'm tempted towards hopelessness. I've done everything I can and nothing has changed. But Jesus is calling us to trust. Think about the strength. It doesn't take any strength to give up. The strength it takes to surrender. The gospel today, the strength it takes to say, okay, 1 mile, I'll go 2 miles. The strength it takes to get struck on one cheek and give the other as well, that's not weakness. That's strength. And where does that strength come from? It comes from this, what you might call unconditional trust. Jesus is calling us to unconditional surrender. When I say unconditional trust, unconditional surrender, it's because Jesus doesn't make a promise. He doesn't say, if you give them the other cheek, they'll realize how wrong they were. Jesus doesn't say that if you hand them over your tunic when they ask for your cloak, they're not going to realize, oh my gosh, what have I done? Jesus doesn't give any condition to this. He just says, in that moment, surrender. In that moment, trust. And so he's calling us to this thing called unconditional trust or unconditional surrender. That regardless of what happens, I'm going to trust. Even though I've done everything I can and nothing's changed, even then, I'm not going to give up. In that moment, I'm going to trust and offer unconditional surrender. This is what happens in Daniel chapter 3. Nebuchadnezzar, right, flew into a rage. Is it true? Had Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, is it true, Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, that you won't worship the altar that I set up, the statue that I set up? Do this now, otherwise, remember the condition, otherwise you shall be instantly cast into the white hot furnace. And who is the God who can save you out of my hands? And this is the moment when anyone else would give up. I've done everything I possibly can do, and there's nothing else to do. Let's just escape, avoid, ignore, run away. And then Hananiah, Azariah, Mishael, they stand up and they answer the king, and they say this. They say, there is no need for us to defend ourselves before you in this matter, O king. If our God whom we can serve will save us, let him save us. That's trust. That's surrender. But then they go on to reveal something even deeper. They go on to reveal unconditional trust. They go on to reveal unconditional surrender. If our God whom we serve can save us, let him save us. But even if he will not, know, O King, that we will not serve your God or worship the golden statue which you set up. Even if he will not. This is the key to unconditional trust. This is the key to unconditional surrender. That I'm his. I'm not going to escape this suffering. I'm not going to run away from this pain. I'm not going to run away from this grief, from this loss. It's so real. I'm going to trust. I'm going to surrender. And even if I don't get what I wanted out of this, I don't have a conditional trust. I don't have a conditional surrender. This is unqualified and unconditional. And this is where Jesus meets us. And this is where Jesus is calling us. Louis Zamperini's life had crashed down all around him. This is the last thing. His life had crashed down all around him. On the verge of divorce, his wife had gone to the tent revival happening in California. The evangelist was Billy Graham. She came back and she said, I gave my life to Christ today. And she said, I'm not going to divorce you, but here's what you need to do. He was relieved because he loved his wife. He said, but here's what I need you to do. I need you to go to the revival with me tonight. And he said, I'm not going to this. She said, well, you have to or else. And he says, okay, fine. He went to one night. The first night, he was so mad. The first night, he left just completely angry. He says, I'm never coming back to this. But the next night, how it worked, but his wife had convinced him to go back that second night. And he sat there and he said, okay, I'll go on one condition. The condition is that when this man up there, this fella says, bow your heads, close your eyes and pray, I get to leave. His wife said, fine, whatever. He shows up and Billy Graham saying like, all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And Louis Zamperini's sitting there thinking, well, duh, I know I'm a sinner. I don't need anyone to tell me that I'm a sinner. I already know that. But then this preacher went on to say, those of you who have a marriage that's out of control, those of you who have a life that's out of control, you have an anger that's out of control. There's so much suffering and grief in your life that is out of control. The only one who can deal with that, only one who can put your marriage back together, the only one who can heal the anger, the only one who can bind you back up is Jesus Christ. He said, I invite you to bow your heads. And that's when Louis got up, started walking out of the tent. Before he got to the door, he stopped and he turned around. And he said, all those years on the life raft, all those years in the prisoner of war camp, he said, my life never flashed in front of me before. But in that moment, my entire life flashed in front of me. And rather than run away from it, I realized that Jesus was in the midst of it. And he walked down the aisle to the very, very front of the stage where Billy Graham had been asking people if they wanted to give their lives to Jesus. He walked there, he knelt down, and he surrendered everything to Christ. So that night was the first night, and as long as he could remember, that he didn't have a nightmare. Until he died in his 90s. He said he never again had a nightmare about how angry he was. Never again had a nightmare about how he was out of control. Never again had a nightmare about what would happen in my life. Why? Because he had given his life to Jesus. He had surrendered everything. When he was stuck, when he had done all that he could do, he could still do one more thing. He could still trust. And this is the same for us. When we've done all that we can do, we then say, Jesus, I surrender. I'm not going to escape. I'm going to engage. When we've done all that we can do, we can tell Jesus, Jesus, you have my unconditional trust. Jesus, you have my unconditional surrender.